Okay, so the third thing to consider when you're looking at changes to populations or limits to populations is the carrying capacity of an ecosystem. So, an ecosystem has only a certain limit to how many species it can hold, right? So, the carrying capacity is essentially talking about, well, what is the maximum number that ecosystem can sustain? Okay, so we'll go back to the example with the pond. Okay, so here's the pond with fish. And maybe we'll have some, we have some plants in there for them to eat. Perfect. Okay, so this pond has only a certain amount of space, a certain amount of food, right, to sustain a certain number of fish. So let's say right now, I would say maybe we can fit in a few more fish. But the maximum number we can fit in there is what's called the carrying capacity. All right, so here we have a number of fish, right? So let's say, and this is like over time, right? So it's like time. So maybe we started off with 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, so let's say we started off with 2 fish, and then over time, it grew to 4 fish. Okay, so it looks like there's enough fish in there, right? Like to live happily. But let's say all of a sudden it jumped to, I don't know, 7 fish. Okay, things are starting to get a little crowded in here. Okay, so what happens is, let's imagine that 4 was our carrying capacity, right? It's like the maximum number that this pond could hold very nicely. Anytime there is some sort of change that would go above the carrying capacity, essentially what happens is there's not going to be enough resources for all of those organisms. So what ends up happening is some of those fish end up dying. Maybe there's not enough food, so some of these fish end up dying. So that's where you're going to see a drop in the population again. So every ecosystem, no matter what you're looking at, has a certain number that it can hold or give enough resources to with over a long period of time. Okay, so what determines this? How do we know what the carrying capacity is? It has to do with the resources available. So the number of species that can be held within a certain amount of space, or how much food is available, how much water is available, how much shelter, if it needs a certain type of habitat, how much space is there, how many predators are there in that area. So there's all those factors that we looked at over here actually have to be considered when we're looking at the carrying capacity. So here we have the number of individuals over time. So naturally, you will see population numbers go up and down. So remember, things are being born and dying every day. But over time, if it stays relatively the same, right? So let's say it stays about the same. That's known as a population equilibrium, or sometimes referred to as a population steady state. So like you don't see huge spikes up and spikes down. So maybe you have 50 rabbits, and maybe sometimes it goes to 52, and sometimes it goes to 45, and sometimes it goes to 47, sometimes it goes to 51. Like the number stays around the same. Of course, over time, you're looking at this not like in 1 week, you're looking at this over the span of like months or years. But if it stays relatively the same, the population is in equilibrium, which means you have a healthy population. Okay, so here's another kind of analogy to help you with carrying capacity. So let's say we have this barrel here, okay, and the barrel is representing a forest, okay, and the water coming in is representing a type of deer species, okay. So the size of this barrel, the amount of water that can go into this barrel is the carrying capacity. Oh, I'll cover my picture. The carrying capacity. So like let's say the barrel can hold 100 deer, right? So that means there's only a certain amount of space for a certain number of deer. There is a limit. So what happens if you go over the population? Well, you're going to have water that's going to spill out of this container. That spilled water can be caused by a whole bunch of different things. But no matter what, the population will go down, like we saw here. If you go above the carrying capacity for this pond, fish are going to die. So it can be starvation. Maybe there's not enough food. Maybe there's more diseases. Maybe there's a lot of predators. The predator's saying, hey, there's a lot of deer in this area. Let's move in. There's lots of things there. It could be lack of space, competition. It could be pollution. Maybe there's not enough available water for everybody, for all of those deer. So regardless of what the instance is that's causing the population to go down, no matter what, if you go above the carrying capacity for an ecosystem, you will have the population numbers beginning to drop. Okay, so this kind of looks at limiting factors, but it's a little bit of a different take. So over here, we were talking about resources that were causing a limit to the population. This is actually talking about environmental conditions that organisms need to thrive in. Okay, so it's known as the law of tolerance. I'm going to use an example here before I get into this. Okay, so let's say you are looking to go outside and it's a sunny day outside. So let's say we have different temperatures. So outside, let's say it's a beautiful summer day. It's 24 degrees Celsius outside. I would say that'd probably be the best scenario for you to go outside and go for a walk. Okay. Now, let's say it was 5 degrees Celsius. Okay, so 5 degrees is still to the point where like you could go outside for a walk, but you might not be super happy about it, right? Like you're happy at 24 degrees, 5 degrees, okay, we can go for a walk, but we're not going to be super thrilled. Same thing if it was 34 degrees Celsius, right? It's probably getting to be a little bit too hot. You could still go for a walk, but like it's not going to be a great time. Probably going to get all sweaty. You're not going to be that happy. So this is like this temperature here is what we can call the optimum temperature. So meaning this is like the perfect condition for you to go out for a walk. 5 degrees or 34 degrees, it's not optimum, like it's not the best scenario, but like you're not going to die if you went for a walk in those temperatures. Okay, now there's a certain temperature change though where you could die. Okay, so for example, let's say it's negative 30 degrees outside. Okay, so it's incredibly cold and you're wearing imagine obviously we can bundle up, but if you're an animal outside, you're not really wearing clothes, right? So let's say if it's negative 30 degrees, you know what? You probably could die if you tried to go for a walk, an hour walk at negative 30 degrees, whereas an hour walk at 5 degrees, you're not going to be happy, but you'll make it. You know what I mean? Same thing with the opposite end of the spectrum. If this was now 54 degrees outside, yeah, you're probably going to die if you tried going for an hour walk outside at 54 degrees Celsius. So this is known as the tolerance or law of tolerance. Tolerance means that it talks about the change in the environment that you could tolerate. Okay, so think of tolerate meaning like you could put up with it. Like you could put up with 5 degrees or 6 degrees or 2 degrees, but you would not be able to tolerate negative 30 degrees or 54 degrees. Okay, the same thing happens with every other living thing, right? So every organism has what's called a tolerance range where you can survive the conditions. But if you go above or below that range, the organism will basically die. Okay. Now, the larger the range, the greater the ability to survive, right? So because we're able to survive in this big span of temperature, it makes us pretty tolerable to change. Like, we're okay. We can survive at 24 degrees and we can survive at 10 degrees. But there are some organisms that cannot survive it. What if we had a tropical fish? Okay, tropical, I don't know what makes this guy tropical. Okay, he's from Hawaii. Okay, he's wearing a flower lei here. So anyways, tropical fish. Tropical fish is going to have a different tolerance range of temperature than we would. Maybe the water being 30 degrees Celsius is like the best scenario for the tropical fish. But maybe if it goes below 20 degrees, if it goes below that, maybe they die. Like, maybe it's not warm enough for them. Or if it goes above a certain temperature, maybe if it goes above 40 degrees, maybe they die then. So the tolerance range of a tropical fish is going to be different from humans, and it's going to be very different from, let's say, a penguin in Antarctica, right? They all have different temperature ranges that they would be happy with. But the key is they all have an optimum, and they all have a point where they would essentially die. Okay, so here's a nice graph representing that. So here we have temperature. This is a specific fish, any fish you'd like, but it's the same thing. So this point here where the population is the highest, this is the optimum range. Okay, so the optimum range is where we have lots of fish. But notice, if it gets too cold, there's a certain time where the fish would basically die lower than that. There's no population. And of course, there's a specific temperature where if it gets too hot, there is again no population. So the range of tolerance is basically, well, what is the range that that organism can actually live in? Okay, and lastly, our density dependent and density independent factors. So when we talk about density here, we're not talking about chemistry density. We're talking about population density. So basically looking at areas that have very large population numbers. So for example, New York City is a very densely populated area, whereas, Northern Ontario, let's say Sudbury, is not very densely populated. Okay, so a density independent factor means it is something that happens to a population regardless of the size. Okay, so think about a tornado. If a tornado is going to come through an area, it doesn't really choose where it goes. It's not, the tornado is going to go through if it's an empty field or if it's through a house, right? The tornado doesn't decide, oh, I'm going to avoid this house. It's going to go through no matter what. Same thing with fires, right? So if you have a fire, the fire is going to go through that area no matter what. Or drought. If it's not raining, if there's no rain coming down, it doesn't matter if there's one tree here or if there's a million trees. If it's not raining, it's not raining. It has no impact because of the population. Whereas a density-dependent factor is something affecting the population because of its density. So let's talk about disease, right? So COVID-19, New York City has a huge problem right now because of the fact it is so densely populated that viruses and diseases can spread so quickly because there's so many people close to one another. Same thing applies to predators and food shortages. If you have a lot of population, the food is going to run out faster than if you have a small population. So you have factors that affect the population because of the size of it, and you have some factors that will affect it and it doesn't matter the size, right? So natural disasters are not really density dependent, they are independent.